Okay, it's been a while, and I'm not going to complete that lyrical sentence, but okay. So, all sorts of things have happened since I last had the chance to um, make one of these videos. Um, we're apparently now in a war, only they won't call it a war. Same way, um, same way that Putin won't call what he's in with Ukraine a war. It's a special military operation. It's a whatever euphemism you might want to use. But still, when it comes down to it, it's not simply that we've somehow, you know, gotten stampeded again as a country into voting for approving a new war. Like we were with Iraq. There was no, hearing before Congress. Congress got ignored this time, completely ignored. There was no build up to a vote for an authorization to use military force, AUMF. That's what they're, called. There was no real consultation. Trump simply went and did it. And there are some people who say, "Oh, that's a good thing. That's the right thing to do." And my response is, "No, it isn't." Look, could America win a war with Iran? I feel yes, we could. Would it be worth it to get into that fight, or more appropriately now, is it worth it to be in that fight? And I think the answer is no. We're seeing the entire Middle East go up in flames, or at least become a hell of a lot less stable, because Trump decided he needed to kill the Ayatollah. And I'm not going to get into this sort of Zionist, anti Zionist sort of thing. I think that's highly disingenuous. I think that adds an unfortunate undercurrent of anti Semitism here that definitely isn't needed. And no, for the record, I don't support the Likud party's actions. I don't support the way they've carried out their war in Gaza. I don't support the way a lot of Israeli policy has been set up under the right wing leadership. Because quite frankly, well, it's just completely inhumane. And also, as somebody who's somewhat sympathetic to the idea of the modern Israeli state, Israel has the right to exist. I also see how what Netanyahu is doing, while it may push a, pro, it might, be this stupendous sort of, we can do whatever we want. We can, we can take it, the fight to our enemies. We can vanquish the evil that faces. Regardless of all that rhetoric, regardless of all that rhetoric, I think in the long term it undermines the defense of Israel, just as in the long term, what we're doing in Iran undermines the defense of the United States. And Trump isn't just fighting a war in Iran; he's fighting it in all kinds of different places, and we've stuck our fists in the hornet's nest in all kinds of different places, and it's costing us. It's costing us treasure. It's costing us lives. It's costing us all sorts of things. And for what? If you want to win a war, it is critically important that the people be in there along with you in that effort. In non democratic states, they understand this too. They push their propaganda to try and get as much public support as possible because even if um, we're not talking a democratic republic like ours, even if we're not talking that, it still can be a destabilizing thing for a war to become unpopular, for the sending of troops to fight that war to become seen as a burden to the people, as a tragedy for the people. If you don't believe me on that, just look at what happened to Russia. Look at what happened to Russia during World War One. It A large part of why they ended up in the trouble that they ended up, you know, basically we're talking the October Revolution. That had a lot to do with the losses and the the deprivation that came with World War One happening basically in their backyard. So this is a great nation can end up collapsing because it chooses the wrong war. And the nation does not have to be a democratic one to suffer, for the leaders to find themselves in real trouble. At the same time, I think we find, the thing about it is, we, the people, will have to pay for this war. And it's already running over budget. Hegseth is already asking for money, more money, to pay for this war. A war that he didn't ask the people if they wanted to have first. Probably because he knew that the answer would be no. The American people are sick of never ending wars. Even the Republicans, although they'll be quick to jump back to defend, because this is the sickness that's overtaken our political system, is that people, instead of kind of analyzing things and saying what are our interests as a people, what what's been the result of these things, these policies, as we've carried them out up to this point. Instead of doing that, we're instead playing it like I have to defend my football team. I have to root for my football team. I have to root, you know, I, you know, I can't question the war because if I question the war, I question the virtue of my soldiers. It's all a bunch of crap, and it doesn't help us win wars, actually. It doesn't help us win wars. In fact, it makes it easier to lose wars because instead of thinking, okay, what do I have to do to make sure that this fight succeeds? Instead, we're trying to build victory out of, castles in the air in our heads, or in the heads of the our leaders. We it's it's a huge part of why we've been dealing with some pretty lousy. It's why we have such a huge national debt. It's why we have such. It's why we have all the so many social problems these days. We're dealing with a way of looking at war where it's just basically okay, our commander in chief tells us where to go and just points us there, and Congress catches up. But this is not the way it's supposed to be. We bear the costs. We bear the costs, and we also bear the lives lost, the bodies torn to shreds. We have to deal with that. We pay those costs. So when we pay those costs, isn't it only right that we decide whether those costs will be taken on? We decide whether we're going to put our fist in that particular hornet's nest. This is yet another thing that has been robbed from the American people, robbed from their representatives. And unfortunately, in this case, with many of the representatives on the right completely forsaking their duty to demand that Trump go through them, to demand oversight. The presidency was not created to be a monarchy, it was created to be, you know, a guy who carries things out. You know, to kind of narrow down the execution to one person. To and what he says, instead of having a whole council of people deciding, what our military does and probably getting all complicated and stuff, you have a one commander in chief who gives the orders. But the idea with that was not that that one commander in chief could just take us to war. In the 1700s, there was no, you know, there was no flying a jet over the ocean to deposit a bunch of troops or to steam a bunch of ships into a certain body of water so they could send out you know, m- cruise missiles or sorties of fighter jets. There was none of that. War was you send people to fight. War was you send ships to fight. War was you send people ships and you pay money to do that someplace else to fight, and it takes weeks for them to get there. Which is, by the way, why they wanted to do the sort of the state militia things instead of why they wanted to do that rather than have a big, standing army to sit over everybody. They wanted to limit that. They wanted to make sure that, again, that the people were in charge of their defense. But what happens here? What's happening with us is that we're basically living out the nightmare for the framers. We've got a rogue president who's basically ordering us into a war that that is going to cost us too much, where it's very unlikely that we'll ever have solid territorial control. In no small part because we blew away the guy who we might have been able to make deals with. When you kill the leaders, that's a nice little sound bite, but it kind of makes it difficult to get unconditional surrender. We didn't kill Emperor Hirohito, and we actually didn't so badly decapitate the Nazi command that they didn't have a few people left. Like I think it was Admiral Donitz who basically accepted you know the treaty for unconditional surrender. We had people, we had some folks to surrender to us. I mean, this is what happens when you think more of your gun than when you're with your brain. You want somebody there to give you their surrender. And what's more, you want there to be some way in which you can get all the people to stand down. If you can't get all the people to stand down, then you're really you're never going to be able to do the delicate sort of state building or have the delicate sort of process of your allies, the people who are demonstrating for democracy. How do we avoid creating a situation where basically it's a bunch of warlords taking over a failed state? How do we avoid it being that the Ayatollahs basically fade back into the background and you know wage a guerrilla campaign the same way the Taliban did? I mean, this is the thing. Again and again, the playbook of our enemies seems to be the same thing. And unfortunately, we're not learning from that. Instead, we're getting these egotistical leaders here who double down on things rather than thinking things through, rather than correcting what they've done wrong. Trump, more than anybody else, has this problem. He doesn't know. He's one of those spoiled rich boys who likely has never gotten in a real fight in his entire life. So he doesn't understand that, fights don't work like they do in the movie. Wars don't work like they do in the movies. Things don't just end when you defeat the bad guy, when you kill the villain. We've killed the villain. But the villain sat on a pyramid of smaller and smaller villains going down to the villain on the street. They didn't have they weren't running this. Um, I mean, we've kind of been corrupted by the success of democratization in the um, in Eastern Europe. And what we forget about Eastern Europe, about how that call that row of dominoes fell, what happened there, and I think this bears understanding, is that what the Russians did was impose governments from above, much the way we have in the past. And they imposed those governments from above, and they used the Red Army to sit on these countries to make sure that those governments stayed. And because of that, when the Red Army got marched back home to Russia, guess what? There was nothing left to keep people from overthrowing their Soviet leaders. And thus, the Berlin Wall fell, and Germany was reunified. I mean, it says something that I've lived longer in a world where Eastern Europe, while not exactly the most splendiferous of places, is much more back to normal than it was when I was a kid. Back in 1989, I was a 9-year old. Imagine growing up as a child, and your childhood is the Cold War. Your first, you start out with you're. I mean, for perspective, the Russia Afghanistan war that starts in 1979, the year I was born. Think about that. I turn I turn 11 about the time that I turn 11 about the time that the Soviet Union falls. It's funny. I mean, I began the first few years of my life under the threat of nuclear destruction. I don't not take seriously the threat of Iran getting a nuclear weapon. However, how do we tell other countries don't get nuclear weapons, don't develop nuclear weapons when we pull shit like this? They're going to say Iran should have stuck with it. Iran should have made the nuclear weapons because then we wouldn't have dared to do what we just did to Iran. Not exactly good for world peace, is it? All these people who want I mean, I have no love whatsoever for the Ayatollahs. I grew up with the Ayatollah Khomeini as as my as one of big pantheons of bad guys. Gaddafi was another one. It's not for nothing that that there's this whole subplot in Back to the Future where basically Doc Brown stole plutonium uh, from bad guys who stole plutonium from a U.S. nuclear site. it's a, it's like it's something of a joke, but seriously, that film is made not 2 years after um after terrorists bombed a marine barracks in Beirut and killed hundreds hundreds of US Marines. It's not for nothing that, Gaddafi is. I mean, that's the thing. I also grew up on Delta Force. You know, it's one of those the Alan Silvestri soundtrack to that movie. Da 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 da. Da, 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 da. That is engraved in my memory. You know, this is sort of where I was as a kid. So, there's a part of me that, you know, there's a part of me that looks at, the Ayatollah dying under a hail of bombs and says, you know, goodbye, see you in hell. But at the same time, there's a part of me that understands that I've lived through enough of these cycles of, oh, here's our new target. Let's throw bombs at it. And, you know, we had, we had this cycle where it was, Shiite terrorists, Shia terrorists under, Iranian control, with hostages, with, the hostage situation, the hostage crisis, in those areas. There were people I remember when I was a kid who were taken hostage and kept for long periods of, and it was like it was years before those people were released. And there were hijackings. It used to be that, you basically just complied with the hijacker, went to the airport, and, if they really wanted to do something about it, they'd storm the plane with commandos and, you know, kill them that way. And, this is part of what actually inspires some of Delta Force. There are very eerie similarities between what happened in that movie, and I believe they're completely intentional. Eerie similarities between what happened in that movie and things like what happened, I think, in Tembe or other such places. And that was what hijacking meant to people pre 9/11. Post 9/11, nobody's going to tolerate a hijacking. I mean, literally, not a few minutes after, the planes hit the Twin Towers and the Pentagon, you have people on the aircraft who are hearing this is happening saying, nope, we'd rather crash the plane with the hijackers in them dying with us rather than you know have our plane be turned into a missile to hit another building or whatever. So that is a big fundamental change from one side of from what was going on in the 80s and 90s as opposed to what's going on now. But it's like, here's the thing. There was a movie about 2006 called Munich, uh, by Steven Spielberg, and it detailed a couple of things. It detailed the the murder of some Israeli athletes at the Munich Olympics. Um, it also detailed the response to that, uh, the which also got documented in a well, kind of. It was the subject of a movie I think that was called Gideon's Sword. One way or another, it was all about I think Spielberg's was the more historically accurate and less sensationalistic of the two. But in essence, it was about it was an illustration of how something that would seem to be a way to get under things under control. You know, take the offensive. Take the offensive attack turns into it turns into a fiasco. It turns into a and the retaliation response becomes an even more sort of it becomes an escalation. You kill you kill some pretty nasty people, and then nastier people replace them. I'm not a peacenik. I'm the sort of person where if you ask me what we should have done in the early 2000s, I would have said focus, focus. Military force does best when it's focused, when it has a defined objective where all the firepower, all the strategic moves can be brought down on one target or one set of targets and deliver results where you know the difference between success and failure. If you don't know the difference between success and failure in an operation, then what's the point? If everything's about kind of hoping that that you did something effective. What's the point? This is the problem. The way the modern conservative community treats war. Their response to Vietnam to Watergate was to get better at lying to people, was to get better at selling to people, was to get better at screwing with people's heads on both sides. And what we've seen in Iraq, what we've seen in Afghanistan, what we ultimately saw in Viet, you know, what we saw there is basically the confirmation that this did absolutely nothing to redeem the sort of efforts we were doing in Vietnam. And on the other side of things, on the political side of things, what the Republicans have done to avoid a repeat of Watergate has, in fact, only made things worse by basically adopting Nixon's motto that if the president does it, that means it is legal. This idea, by saying that that will be how we define power in the courts, it's only dug them in deeper. It's only made things worse. At the end of the day, you really, if you make everything about basically perception and you know just stirring people's brains in circles, what you're going to end up with is a complete lack of awareness of where your efforts are going and failure resulting from that. We won't win wars until we return to a model of foreign policy that understands that there have to be solid objectives, that there have to be that these sort of vague sort of things that are good for selling to people, on television and whatnot, that that isn't going to win anything. We have to we have to realize that the American people deserve a government that isn't treating them like children to be talked down to, but rather as equals, as citizens to discuss things with, like adults. We keep on trying to make this a system where we have a whole bunch of elites that who presume themselves to be the most mature, the most balanced, the most truthful of all people, talking down to the rest who are just fools who cannot understand. But the truth of the matter is, we're all equals. That's what our basic philosophy says. We are equals. The president is first among equals. We did not create the presidency in order to have somebody who ruled like a king. We were sick of kings, and we were sick of them for a good reason. Because basically, you're just counting on one person to somehow have perfect judgment, one person to be the anointed, one person to embody us all. We needed a system that was more representative than that. We needed a system where people would not go off on a hair because they knew that would lose them their job. I mean, if you want to know how effective that can be, one of the only reasons why we didn't have this war in Trump's first term was because he feared that he wouldn't get reelected, which is deeply ironic if you understand that right now are the main reason why he's not concerned about that anymore is that you guys reelected him. You guys put him back into office and as a lame duck, as a president who no longer had to face the possibility of being booted from office. Pardon me. So it's like Trump has, we've let Trump come to believe that he is basically all but a king. That's why we did the no kings thing. It's not because we were somehow confused. Oh, we thought that Trump was a king. No, we're trying to unconfuse Trump about the fact that he's not one. We're trying to make it clear to him that he's not supposed to be going off on his own, getting us into trouble like this, forcing us to have to deal with the backlash from the Iranians who basically occupy a central place in that arena and who can basically cause everybody around them trouble, from the Israelis to the Saudis to the Qatari folks to whoever. It's another reason why we want to discuss these things because we've had a heck of a lot of blowback from all these wars we fought that didn't exactly do us a world of good. We deserved to have that war discussed of us. We deserve to be able to tell him no. And now we're in it. Now good people are going to die, and they're going to die because I don't know why. So I guess with that cheerful thought, I'm going to leave y'all. You all have a good night. And let's hope that this all ends well.